webinars are made possible thanks to generous donor support. If you'd like to contribute, please visit our website, autism.org.
Thank you, Denise, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to now talk about a topic that's very close to my heart, and I think something that's of interest to the community: pet ownership and how it relates to autism. Okay, so today in my talk, I'm going to cover sort of just a brief introduction, why pet ownership is an important topic within autism research. I'm going to talk about some of the theoretical aspects that underpin the benefits of pet contact and animal contact. I'm then going to focus on a mixed method study that I conducted and was recently published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And I'm going to talk about what these two studies that I'm presenting on mean for the autism community, what some future directions are for research and practice and applications. And then hopefully I'll get some wonderful questions from you all. Also, I just wanted to make a note about the language that I'm using. I use identity first language, so autistic people, but I know there's lots of ways that we talk about autism, and just to let you know. Okay, so briefly, an introduction. Why should we care about pet ownership and pet contact in relation to autism? So an estimated 80% of autistic children have participated in some form of animal therapy. So it's something that this community is seeking out. There's some very interesting research by Carlisle, who looked at the incidence of pet ownership in families with an autistic child compared to families that have neurotypical children. And what she and her lab found are that families with autistic children were significantly more likely to own a pet, and they sought out pets for their children because they thought that it would improve social cognition and social responsiveness. We also know that animals are a common special interest in the autistic population. So special interest and restricted interest, this is something that is common within autism, and animals continuously are cited as one of those things that autistic people are drawn to and might even have some expertise in. And then finally, there's some very interesting research that suggests that autistic people might even be more socially responsive towards animals than people. And I'm going to get into some of this research, but a lot of the research that underpins this is some experiments that have been done looking, for instance, at who an autistic person or child approaches in a room when it's a human agent as opposed to an animal agent. They seem more approaching to the animal agent. So let's talk a little bit about some of the theoretical underpinnings for animal connection and how that relates to the autism spectrum. So a lot of the research I'm going to talk about is covered in my review of this topic, Seeing More Than Human in Frontiers in Psychology. This is an open access publication and anyone can read it. It's not behind a paywall, and it covers a lot of this research that I'm going to talk about in the context of animals. It also looks at this in connection to cartoons and robots. So I'm particularly interested in how autistic people connect to anthropomorphic or non-human social agents. But let's talk about animals specifically and why animal connection is important. Well, for one thing, animal connections are important for all of us. And the theory that underpins this is called biophilia, or a love of nature. And this theory essentially says that right now we're living in really just a snapshot in time, modern civilization. For most of human history, we've lived in nature, and animals have been a very important part of that. So animals we've used for survival, we've also used them for protection. And this last one, the idea of animals and protection and the domestication of animals, is something that's studied quite a lot, and usually in connection with dogs or canines. And what we find is that there's some very special neurohormones that are released when we look into the eyes of animals. So they've done some research looking at eye contact with dogs. And what we find is that when we look into the eyes of dogs, we have a release of serotonin, which is kind of the happy chemical. And this prompts us to continue to make direct eye contact with dogs. But that feedback doesn't stop with us. Dogs also experience serotonin when they make eye contact with us. And so this is a kind of feedback loop that probably helps explain why we have such a strong social connection to domesticated animals. So they've also done this research with wolves, and they find that wolves do not release serotonin in humans and vice versa. So there's been kind of an evolution with our domesticated animals and us, where we've co-evolved together to feel love, connection. And so this eye gaze research is something that I'm particularly interested in. And I've kind of circled here some of the key areas that we do some facial recognition and eye gaze research using eye tracking. And what we find is that on a lot of research that compares autistic people to neurotypical people and what parts of the face autistic people look at the most, they find that in human faces, autistic people are often less likely to look at eyes. And this is kind of a pretty well-known feature of autism, is differences in eye gaze. And so the inner parts of a face are places where autistic people look less in general, but also they tend to look more at mouth regions, which are in some ways less communicative usually than eye regions. But that's not a trend that we see in animal faces. So a lot of research suggests that autistic people actually do feel comfortable looking at the eye areas of animal faces. And this might have to do with this feedback loop, where autistic people feel more comfortable and maybe experience more serotonin when looking directly at the eyes of an animal than a human. And this might be also because animals give more kind of obvious or direct social signals. So humans are notorious for giving very subtle communicative cues. So I might say something, but my face suggests I actually mean the opposite thing. Or my language might say that I'm happy to see someone, but my tone of voice says otherwise. There's all kinds of contradictory cues that we have to put together to understand what someone really means. And we find that autistic people often struggle with putting all of those cues together or processing those cues quickly. And so they often might miss some of those subtle signals or not pick up on them in time. But what we find with animals is that there's some really direct and obvious cues that they use to communicate, and these aren't language-based. So for instance, showing teeth, wagging a tail, having the ears perk up, those are still very communicative and indicative of a social creature, but they're not very subtle and they don't have a lot of hidden messages. And that might be really helpful for autistic people because they can learn those messages and consistently apply kind of that coding scheme. And so these reasons, this idea of a feedback loop, of being able to clearly interpret animal behavior, might underpin why we see animals being a common social interest for autistic people. So I'm going to now spend a bit of time talking about some research that I recently did that's been published in JADS. This is, again, an open access publication, so please do check it out if you're interested. So this study that I did is a mixed method study, which means that it has a quantitative or numerical data-driven component, and it also has a qualitative component where I interviewed people and interpreted what they said through a kind of thematic phenomenological analysis. So 2 studies, and I'm going to talk through the findings and what I think they might mean for people that are thinking about pet ownership who are autistic or have autistic family members. Okay, so in study 1, I surveyed 700 participants, half of whom were autistic. These were all adults, and I surveyed them on lifetime ownership, pet attachment, and mental health. In study 2, I interviewed autistic participants only, and I interviewed them about their pet experiences. And the goal of this study was to understand what are the real-life applications for pet contact for autistic people. How can we understand the importance of pet ownership and also be realistic about some of the challenges? So it was a rather exploratory study because even though there's a lot of evidence that pet contact and animal contact is really important for autistic people, we actually don't have as much research as you would think on this topic. Okay, so my methods for study one is I surveyed 700 participants, half of whom were autistic. I asked them about their autism diagnosis, their pet ownership history, so both in childhood and adulthood, whether they owned pets and specifically what type of pets, in asking for each species. I then surveyed them using some pre-established measures of pet attachment. And then I asked them some questions about anthropomorphism of pets, so how they see pets as human-like. I then surveyed them on some mental health questions, particularly focusing on anxiety, which is one of the most common co-occurring mental health conditions in autistic people. And then I asked them about their quality of life, so essentially how satisfied they were with their life outcomes in various aspects, like social, monetary, economic, etc. So I had some really interesting findings, and I'm going to talk about some of the main ones, but there's definitely more in the paper. Please do check it out if you're interested in this topic. So first of all, contrary to what some previous research has found, in my sample, I found that autistic people were significantly less likely to own pets as both children and adults. And you can see that in this table to your right. So we still see very high rates of pet ownership among the people that I surveyed. And I was not putting out a call specifically for people who owned pets. This was simply left open for individuals who met this criteria, autistic or non-autistic. And what we found is that 91% of neurotypicals had owned a pet at some point in their life, whereas this was only 81% of autistic people, so a significant difference. However, we found that pet ownership was something that was important. In particular, having owned a pet at some point in your life corresponded with better life satisfaction. I think, though, it's important to not necessarily, make too much of this finding, or maybe to not distance this finding from the context. When you are able to own a pet, it likely corresponds to being able to have a job, have independent housing, and feel capable to take on that responsibility. All of those things might themselves correspond with better life satisfaction. However, we did find this trend in both groups, and so it would suggest that pet ownership is intrinsically linked with better life quality. Very important finding here, there was equal attachment to pets in both groups. Non-autistic and autistic people were equally attached to their pets. I was thinking when I did this survey that possibly my hypothesis was that autistic people would be even more attached, but what we found was that attachment was extremely high in both groups. However, I think that this is still a very important finding, even though there weren't differences, because there's a lot of myths out there about autistic people. And one of them is that they don't have the same emotional connection to things that non-autistic people do. I think that that's an absolute fallacy. And this is a study that kind of confirms that in a sense, or a finding. There was equal attachment. Both groups love and care for their animals. Autistic people were more likely to own non-dog pets. So the most popular pet worldwide and also in our study were dogs. So 59% of neurotypicals own dogs and 48% of autistic people own dogs. However, very close contender for the autistic group and still close in neurotypical were cats. And then autistic people were significantly more likely to own other types of pets as well. And we had all of the list: horses, reptiles, fish, farm animals, lots of lots of variety in there, but dogs were not as popularized in the autistic group. Also very important, the type of pet did not change attachment. And this was something that I had suspected and was confirmed. There's a lot of research out there that is specifically on the canine-human bond. And I think that part of the reason for that is that dogs are very easy to train, and we're able to take dogs into all kinds of settings, which itself is a benefit that I'm going to talk about. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be studying or placing equal importance on other types of animals, particularly as smaller animals might be more accessible and easier to care for. And so we're going to talk about that. So if people feel like if they're going to get a pet, it needs to be a dog to have the types of effects that they want to see, my research does not indicate that that's the case. I also did some analysis looking at why people own these pets. What are they getting out of them? And what I found was that one of the measures I took, the Lexington Pet Attachment, has a subscale for pet substitution, which is essentially using your pet as a substitute for human contact. And we found that autistic people were significantly higher on this measure, and that there was a mediating relationship between substitution of your pet for a person and social avoidance. But what we found is that owning a pet didn't mean that autistic people were then led to be more socially avoidant. What we instead found is that autistic people are themselves more socially avoidant, and having a pet mediated that relationship. It meant that they substituted their pet for people. So it was almost a compensation for being more socially avoidant of people. You then relied quite a bit on your pet, which I think can be a very positive thing. And finally, only in autistic people, not neurotypical people, we found that pet attachment related to better mental health. So having a stronger attachment with your pet meant that you had better mental health outcomes, which is really strong evidence for the benefits of pet contact. Okay, so I was interested in kind of who I am as a researcher. I like my quantitative research, but I really like talking to people in the autistic community and getting the stories and understanding how we can go further with this research in ways that only people from the autistic community can tell us, because they're the experts on their own experience. So I did a semi-structured interview with 16 autistic people that had participated in my survey, and they were current or past pet owners. And some of my questions included things like, tell me about your past pet experiences, tell me about your attachment to your pet, and then tell us about some of the benefits and challenges for pet ownership. The interviews took about 30 minutes to 1 hour, and then I coded them using interpretive phenomenological analysis, which meant that I coded the interviews with another researcher, and we kind of found common ground on what the themes were that came out of these interviews. And so these are the themes. I'm going to talk through some of the findings in the next slides, but basically we found that pets, of course, had a lot of benefits. Some of these sub-themes talk about that specifically. Pets were a social alternative. So there's the type of kind of interaction you have with a human, and an animal gives you a totally different experience, which can be really helpful. Pets were a social lubricant. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but basically they gave you opportunities for talking to people. And there were barriers to pet ownership, but there were also breakthroughs in that. There were reasons to, and some people said reasons to live because of having a pet. Okay, so one of the biggest benefits that came out that stands out from this research are the sensory benefits of a pet. And on each of these slides, I'm going to include some quotes from participants, and I'll let you read those, but I'm going to kind of talk through this theme. So essentially, participants talked about some of the sensory benefits that had to do with the way that fur feels, the way that scales feel. And then some people talked about the actual weight of a pet and how this can calm you down and get you back into your body. It also gives you something repetitive to do with your hands. And so we know that a lot of autistic people get a lot of sensory stimulation from doing the same thing with their hands. And this is kind of put to really good use with a pet. And it's kind of a bidirectional benefit because pets love being petted. And it's very calming for autistic people to be able to do that motion and get that tactile response. So something that came out in these themes for sure. Companionship. Animals are a type of social presence that also don't put a lot of pressure on a person. So they're sort of there and they can fade into the background if they need to, but they can also become the center of focus if they need to. And in this sense, animals can be a really calming presence. They give autistic people a feeling that they're not alone, but also not a feeling that there's all this pressure on them to perform. And that's something that was brought up quite a bit. So a big one that we found was this idea of judgment in human contact and how animal contact meant no judgment. One of the biggest mental health kind of barriers for autistic people is something that's being studied quite a lot now, and it's the idea of masking or camouflaging. And essentially, for those of you who are autistic or know autistic people, you know that there is a lot of pressure to conform to the way that neurotypicals want you to behave. So things like eye contact, things like making sure you're saying the right thing, it's very stressful and is actually linked to a lot of poor mental health outcomes. And while we're doing a lot of work in autism research to try and educate the public about how we need to understand and embrace neurodiversity, this is still something that's a problem. And pets offer, I think, a solution to that in a sense, because pets appreciate the care that you give them. They're not there to judge how you're doing it. So taking care of a pet's most basic needs, giving them social care, nurturing them. These are things that you can do in your own way, and your pet will always appreciate that and let you come to that as you are. And that was a huge benefit for the participants I talked to. They felt successful, they felt loving, and they didn't feel like there was any wrong way to do that with their pet. And so in that sense, it was a huge confidence builder and boost for self-esteem. One thing that we found that I think is a really important aspect of dogs, even though I'm a big believer in having alternative pet options, smaller pet options, dogs were really important in my participants' stories about socially connecting with people in the community. So for instance, for those of you who are dog owners, you're probably pretty familiar with the kind of conversational banter people have with you about your dog. What's your dog's name? What breed are they? How old are they? Those types of questions. Dog owners often strike up conversations with people about their pets. Pets are also something that are pretty universally beloved. When you see a dog, if like me, you have a smile, you want to pet them, they put their owner in a good light. This is the type of person that owns a pet. And you start to see that person in a positive way. And that was something that a lot of the dog owners I interviewed talked about, that they felt like they had a lot of confidence because people were coming up to them, and they were coming up to them with some kind of good news in a sense, or some positive affect because of their pet with them. But there was also social lubrication with just having a pet at home, being able to talk to a fellow pet owner about a pet. That was something that people found they connected with other family members, they connected with people in their community because they shared a love of animals that gave them a kind of positive identity that they could form other relationships with people. So I would be very remiss if the conclusion to this presentation is, now everyone go out and get a pet. We all know that there are certainly barriers and challenges for everyone who thinks about adoption, but there are some maybe particular barriers or things to think about when doing so with an autistic person or family member, perhaps. At least that's some of the things that my participants talked about. So some of the barriers and challenges are pretty straightforward. There's some economic things that people have to think about. We know that autistic people, when living independently as adults, are less likely to have full-time employment. There's, of course, issues with all of us with housing and how that some rent precludes you from having a pet. And that was something that some of my participants brought up. I'd like to have a pet. I'm not allowed to have one where I live. But I think one of the biggest barriers that came up in my interviews was this idea of, well, I'm an autistic person, so can I really be responsible for taking care of something else? And so there was this kind of self-doubt about whether the autistic traits that might lead someone to be very engrossed in a video game or whatever they're doing might mean that they would neglect their animal, or maybe that there are some sensory issues like the mess or having to be on a schedule that also precluded pet ownership. So these are some things that a few of my participants who had only had pets as children and no longer had them as adults brought up, and kind of some fears around that. But most of my participants kind of suggested that actually a breakthrough is the responsibility that comes with pet ownership. Pet ownership gave them a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to put down the video game, a reason to make sure that they had some type of employment or their housing sorted so that they could take care of their animals. There were some amazing stories about people seeing a kitten and having to bring them into the office and take the risk that the boss would see the kitten under the desk. But that changed their lives because then they had a pet for the first time and they got so much out of it. This is a finding that doesn't necessarily say, see, you should go out and adopt a pet right away, but it is something to think about. Sometimes having those responsibilities and saying this is something that everyone needs to chip in on because we have this animal that needs our care could actually end up being a positive thing. Okay, so we've talked about some of these challenges for pet ownership, and they're real and they absolutely need to be thought of. And so that's some of the future directions I'm going to talk about. But we know there's some economic challenges to having a pet. Some pets are a lot more expensive than others. For instance, dogs are significantly more expensive than even cats. There's also some economic costs in a sense of what type of work you can be doing to also be sure to be home consistently and be able to walk your dog, for instance. But all pets come with cost. Housing is an issue. Some places won't allow you to have pets if you're in shared housing, this type of thing. Self-doubt. Can I really take care of a pet? There's so much more that I have on my plate. Will this be complementary with my sensory issues? These types of things, for instance, sensory. And then this all or nothing thinking. I think this comes up a lot with the dog ownership aspect, particularly, or kind of that the only way there is to have animal contact is through pet ownership. So I have some ideas that came about from this research that might be helpful on this topic. So first of all, my findings suggested that smaller pets are every bit as important and lead to attachment that dogs do. So smaller pets still provide a lot of sensory benefits. I had participants talking about what it feels like to have a lizard on their hand and feeling the scales. And of course, cats have beautiful fur. Someone even had some budgies and he loved watching them fly around and petting their feathers. So these things are not lost with a smaller pet. There's some really interesting research actually that's being done looking at guinea pigs, which is a very common school pet and how autistic children, when they are able to hold a guinea pig, have less cortisol, they have a slower heart rate, which indicates less stress, and they're actually connecting more with neurotypical peers, who in turn connect more with them. So having a guinea pig is kind of a social buffer. This is a really manageable small pet. Also could be a really nice companion animal. These animals, of course, also provide companionship in different ways, of course, than larger pets, but similar benefits seem to come through from my survey. Biophilia, this appreciation for nature, having a different species in your home, and then responsibility. One of the, I think, most interesting findings from this is that the responsibility of a pet is itself a positive thing. So one alternative, if pet ownership is not in the cards or is maybe something to think about in the future, is volunteerism. A lot of my participants volunteered. They volunteered at animal shelters, or they fostered, which we're going to talk about, or they volunteered at horse farms where they did programs for people with disabilities. And it was a very positive experience because they were able to not only grow their competencies in taking care of animals, but it gave them some job experience and it gave them some really positive connections with the community. So we know from some research that animals who are in shelters and have animal contact have longer lives and also are more likely to be adopted. So it's really a bi-directional kind of relationship between the benefits it might give for humans to volunteer and get this animal contact and animal experience, and the benefits that pets get from being socialized and having an animal come and spend time with them. Yeah. One of my participants made a wonderful suggestion that is something I definitely want to try and pursue in some of my research, which is the idea of having a pet mentor. So a pet mentor would be someone that checked in on the autistic person or the family with an autistic child and saw how is pet ownership going? Do you want to come and take a walk with me? Do you want to see what I do with my pet? Let's talk about how you can get support, because there are a lot of challenges or certainly changes when you take a pet into your home. And sometimes it can be overwhelming. And to have someone that can walk you through that process, maybe someone that is also autistic or a family member of autistic person, could be really helpful. Could also be helpful to have that network if for some reason you needed to go away or out of town and you're really worried about who can watch your animal. Well, having a kind of network of people that can be support for pet could be really helpful. It also, of course, gives you another social connection within the community, which is always a good thing. So what are some ways to start? Fostering is a great way to figure out, is a pet right for me, particularly if you're thinking about a dog or a cat. There's lots of dogs or cats that need temporary homes until they find their forever home. It could also be that fostering for you leads to permanent adoption. And it's a great way to try out what are the challenges with this, but also what are the benefits. Talking to other parents, for instance, if you're a parent of a child with autism, how is a pet fit into their lives? What have their experiences been with this? Is it a lot of work and too much to take on, or do the benefits outweigh the costs? It's a whole family decision. So one of the things that people talked about in my interviews or some of my participants is that really it's brought the family together because it's given everyone something to focus on. What's the dog doing right now? Does the dog need to go out? Is it time to feed the dog? Oh, they're so funny. It's a conversation point that can be really helpful because families are often flung in all different directions. And we know it's so important for an autistic person to be embedded in a social network. And so having this opportunity to talk about something and come together as a family could be really helpful. I'm a big advocate, definitely based on my findings, of thinking about smaller pets, because I'm a little biased. I'm a cat owner and my family's always been cats. I love cats. I get so much out of them socially, and I find that they're so manageable because they don't need to be walked. I can leave them on their own for a lot longer, and I still get so much out of my cat. And I think that I always encourage people who say, well, I can't have a dog, it's too difficult, how would I do that? There are more manageable options for pets, and we still see a lot of benefits for those. And then finally, this idea of responsibility, I think, is really important. Being upfront from the outset about what are the responsibilities that this would entail, what's the budget, who's going to take care of these different things, and how can we manage that? We know that if you are a parent of a child with autism, you have so much on your plate, and having a pet shouldn't be something that adds on to that. It should be something that comes with enough benefits that it outweighs the costs. And so it's really good to think about, is that going to be the case? Can I take steps if I'm interested in this idea of pet ownership to balance out that cost, and how can I try it? So basically being realistic and patient with yourself. So in summary, pets can be an important part of autistic people's social development and social connection. My research suggests that having a pet does correspond with better well-being. In autistic people, particularly, pet attachment, so the bond that you have with your pet, also corresponds with your positive mental health. Interviews with autistic pet owners reveal a range of benefits that I've walked through, but we need to be realistic that there are indeed some barriers to pet ownership. So we need to think as a community about small steps towards pet ownership or pet contact, and how we can increase animal contact, because this is a really important topic, and it can be, I think, just a huge turning point for a lot of people, including autistic people. Okay. So this is my team that works with me on this work. I'm at Edgehill University, which is right outside of Liverpool. I also work on this with my colleague, Liam, who's also at Edgehill. This was my master's student, Emma, who conducted my interviews with me and analysis, and Andrea Piovason, who is also involved through data analysis. And then most importantly, my collaborators, my two cats. This is how they sleep together all the time. It's classic yin and yang. And thank you so much for attending today. And I'd like to please answer any questions that you might have. I think there are some that have popped up in this Q&A. So let me go ahead and read them. Okay, so someone asked, what are the challenges of autism and pet ownership? Yeah, so I think that some of the challenges that came up were things that we would expect that are probably challenges for everyone. I think all of them are challenges for everyone. So some of the economic costs, some of the housing costs, but I think there's also a fear. Autistic people are often given the message, you need help. I think that's a common thing, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. And it might lead autistic people to doubt themselves, doubt their ability to, for instance, take care of a pet. But my interviews showed that people were more than capable of taking care of pets and got a lot out of it. But of course, this will depend very much on the person, and hopefully I've laid out some ideas for gradual steps to pet ownership and alternatives to ownership. Okay. Would pet therapy or an emotional support animal be beneficial as well? Oh, that's a really good question, Leslie. So I didn't explore pet therapy in my study, but when I worked at special educational schools, I've been a part of some fabulous pet therapy that was happening, and pet therapy is extremely common within the autism community. there's some fantastic research that's being done on equine therapy. They do some really nice controlled studies where they find that autistic children improve in all types of ways from horse therapy, including even a reduction in autistic symptoms like sensory difficulties. So I think it's a really important area to look at further. I'd love to do some research in that. And yeah, so an emotional support animal, absolutely. I would probably classify that around just pet ownership. And yes, I think it's very beneficial. And we need more funding really for that because they're very expensive. I hope that answered that, Leslie. But yes, I think pet therapy is fantastic and very, very beneficial. So Michelle, my son is 17 and going to college in 2023. He desperately wants an emotional support or therapy cat. Can anyone send me the process for obtaining a therapy animal? That's a great question. I don't have that information. I looked into it. I'm based in the UK. I looked into it there, and I know that there is support for that. I'm sure there is in America as well, and hope maybe someone on the chat can send you any information they have. Sorry, I'm not more helpful with that one. It's very important though. So if anyone knows of process for obtaining a therapy animal, and if they could put that into the chat. What are the indicators of better mental health in a pet owner? So I specifically in my study looked at mental health using anxiety measure. What did I use? Trying to remember what the name is that I used. There's so many different ways that you can look at mental health. You could look at other internalizing conditions, for instance, like depression. But I'm interested in looking at anxiety, and because it's the most common co-occurring mental health condition in autism. So that's what I studied in my research, in my survey. Yeah. And so my indication of better mental health was decreased or anxiety, essentially. And also, I guess a proxy for mental health, this is kind of a broad term, would also be satisfaction with life. My autistic daughter is so connected with our pet, she often holds her past the cat wanting to be held, which results in some biting and scratching. In addition, my daughter finds it difficult to be away from the cat, especially when on vacation. Do you have any suggestions? I think I think that's probably common. And I think it shows, though, how much she loves the cat. But yeah, she's maybe forgetting the cat's needs. So some of my research that I do is on what's called theory of mind, or basically taking the perspective of something else. And I think that maybe a solution, or at least a strategy for this, is trying to talk to your daughter about thinking about how the cat feels. So trying to use a lot of language with her about kind of from the cat's perspective, or thinking, does the cat like that? How does it feel when you're held like that? Do you ever feel like you want to get loose? That's how the cat's feeling right now. And showing appropriate ways to interact with the cat and saying, see the cat starting to purr. That means that she's happy. Your job is to get the cat to purr as much as possible. So trying to get your daughter to think a little bit about what's going on in the cat's mind. But I think being away from the cat on vacation, one thing that I love is I have this automatic cat feeder for when we're on vacation for not very long time, maybe a day or two, and I'm able to see the cat on the camera. And so one thing that maybe, and I honestly get the same, I miss them so much. And so what it's able to do is when their feeder goes off, the cats of course come around to eat, and I'm able to see them on the camera. And it makes me feel so much better, because sometimes I just get anxiety, like, are they okay? And so if they're being watched by someone, maybe once a day saying, can you send us a video or send us a picture? Or if you have something where you're leaving them at home and someone's maybe coming in once a day to take care of them, think about maybe one of these cat feeders that has a video camera, and then she can spend time looking at them. I totally understand that. I'm the same. I think though it shows how much she's getting out of this cat that's happening. So that's a good thing, even though that's stressful. David Clark, what pets are great for autism? So great question. My research suggests that all animals seem to be good for autism. They all linked with better outcomes, and they all linked with strong attachment. There were no differences across the board depending on species. So I think that what this suggests more than anything is if you have a dog, that's fantastic. Dogs are amazing. I love them. But not everyone can have a dog because they are the most expensive pet. They require daily walking, and they are just big. And some people can't take a really big dog around all the time. And so, of course, it depends on dog breed. But I think that suggests that find a pet that works for you and see what you like, see what your child likes if it's for your child, see what would fit best in your family with your schedule. And that kind of underlying theory of biophilia and the sensory aspects of pets, that will still be there, but you'll also maybe have a more personalized experience with less downsides. All right, lots of questions. This is great. So happy. We have so many animals, 3 dogs, 5 cats, 2 lizards, and 3 ferrets. Oh, cool. I would say my favorite are the non-dog as well. We have them because my husband loves dogs. As you can tell, I clean a lot. Absolutely. There's actually some really interesting research on early child development that says that the best thing for for development of social cognition is to have dogs and cats in the household. So something about the way that animals interact with one another, even though they're different species, makes you think all the time about what they're thinking and what they're experiencing, which is really good for social cognition. And I guess the way that you talk about different animal behaviors to your children is so helpful. So I think that's fantastic. A lot of people that I interviewed did not just have one type of pet. They had like all of them. And I think it speaks as well to, there's a lot of autistic people are total animal lovers. Cool. Correlation or causation. Thanks, Ian. So correlation. So I did a correlation analysis with mine. I did not do regressions. Yeah. So that's that. That's kind of why I was also prefacing a little bit about the links with satisfaction with life, correlating with, what was it that it correlated with? Oh, with pet ownership. We can't draw too many conclusions, and we also would have to control for other factors. So my survey was already pretty long, but I think a really important thing to think about are, you know, where you are in life in terms of job, independent living, that sort of thing, that typically also correlates with better quality of life. I, for instance, wasn't able to adopt my cats until I had my own place to live. I had like a poor student and I couldn't have a pet as well, kind of moving as well between countries. So I probably have a higher quality of life now and pets, but they're kind of also separate. But the other research, I think the other findings also suggest that you know, pets do boost our mental health, particularly when you're autistic. Thank you. Good question. What about people with autism who hoard animals? That's really interesting. Yeah, I think hoarding is a fascinating topic in and of itself. I would be very interested in that. So some of the research I do is this anthropomorphism, which is essentially the idea of assigning human characteristics to non-human things. That can include animals, like saying, oh, you know, my cat is, you know, scheming about how he's going to take over the world. But it also is something that happens a lot in hoarding. So one of the theories about why people hoard is that they start to get too attached to their items and they see them almost as social creatures. They can't throw away that, you know, wrapping paper because it has feelings. And so that's something that is definitely of interest in this connection with autism. And so finding out about hoarding in connection with this, I think, would be really interesting. Yeah, great idea. I'll have to find some participants, but yeah, it's a good thought. Seems like you focused on high functioning autistic people. Absolutely. I did. You're right. On the kind of back of this, of doing any type of survey, really, that's an online survey, I'm excluding a big part of the population, about 40%, which is, I think, yes, something that absolutely needs to be explored, that side of this research in the group of autistic people that have more challenges and co-occurring intellectual disability, possibly. I did not explore the benefits directly. I think, though, that's a really cool idea. I'm going to write it down. Oh, I don't have anything wrong. I'll remember it. And I think maybe also comparing and seeing what the challenges and benefits are in comparison with both of these groups, what you call high functioning or maybe less functional needs. It's really important. And thank you. It's a good idea. Who is doing the equine research? That's a good question. Who is doing that? So one researcher that, if you're interested in this, it does a lot of really good work, is named O'Hara. She does work with Temple Grandin, for instance, and yeah, they do a lot of research on O'Hara. I think it's Marguerite O'Hara. A good place to look is she's done some systematic reviews looking at pet therapy and pet interventions, and it has a lot of the studies on equine research within that she's reviewed, and they've done some really fabulous kind of controlled studies. So please check out her work, and they do a lot of that. What is the most unique pet that came up in your studies? Just curious. Oh, it's a good question. So the way that I sort of grouped it in my survey was, I don't have the categories here, but it's like terpine, amphibious, birds. But then in my interviews, I think the most interesting for me, because I don't think I really know what they are, but one of my participants used to have a dog, and that was his quote about how he had the dog, Kai, and he was able to just walk around and meet people. But he's not able to have a dog now because he's a student and he's living in an apartment. So he has these budgies, which I think are small birds, and they just fly around all the time. And he adores them, and they like land on him, and he gets so much out of seeing them in nature. So that was kind of fun. But then I had one lady I interviewed that has a lot of animals, and she was talking about the lizard and how her son just loves to feel his texture and have him walk all over. I thought that was quite cool. So those are some of the more unusual ones. Oh, I think someone had a chameleon, which was cool. Oh no, it was some kind of a toad. Yeah, so lots of different animals. Is there a specific rubric points for owning? Is there a specific rubric for owning a cat for a child with autism? I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not sure about that. I don't know of anything like that, like a checklist, I'm guessing, for how to take care of a cat. See, I think that's exactly the type of resource that could be really helpful, particularly maybe working with autistic people in the community, because some of the things that neurotypical people might think of are like obvious or something like that. Maybe it takes someone in the community to point out, well, the specific things you need to think about. So I'm not sure, but that's a good idea. Oops. So how can I contact the host for more info? Oh, good. I think that would be Denise Fulton at Autism Research Institute. She is someone that, or unless you mean me, the host, and then you can contact me. Here, I'll put this live so anyone can reach out to me if they have any questions. Oh, my keyboard's not working. this is kind of my address that I use for all my publications because I've just had it forever. It's my old Vanderbilt address. So please, everyone, do get in touch. Hopefully you can see that on the chat. Please, if you think of more, because I know we're coming up short on time, but I'm happy to stay here as long as you guys are. My 15-year-old autistic grandson's aggressive behavior decreased immensely after getting a dog and a cat. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I think my aggressive behavior decreased immensely. It's a very calming to have an animal. I think all of those benefits I talked about are absolutely just being able as well to feel like there's someone there that always has a good impression of you is so helpful. And then the sensory and just being calm with that thing. That's really good news. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I think it's so important. Can you shed any light in your schooling career, how you got into this field? Oh, wow, sure. I was a child development major at Vanderbilt University. I then got my master's in counseling from University of Houston, where I got involved in autism research because I worked at a special educational school and I liked it so much. I then got my Ph.D. in educational psychology, also from the University of Houston, where I got to do all the autism research I wanted. And that put me on a track to going to the UK, where they do some great work. So I'm currently at Edge Hill University, which is right outside of Liverpool, where the Beatles are from. So I got into this field because I absolutely love working with autistic people and thinking about how to improve autistic outcomes. I think it's so important. Thanks for asking that. Do any of your participants own chickens? Probably, yeah. I would imagine. I don't think anyone talked about it specifically, but I did have one participant who had such a menagerie of animals outside. She was based in the UK, and so there's like tons of horses that people have kind of little farms sometimes. What breed of dog would you suggest for an 11-year-old? That's a great question. I think it really depends on what kind of breed would work well for you. So we know that some things to maybe think about are things like lifespan. I think that some big dogs are really fabulous, but they don't live as long, and that can be maybe difficult, short lifespan to deal with kind of loss, maybe. Some dogs are a lot louder. Maybe some dogs require a lot more exercise, which could be a really good thing. We know there's health benefits from being forced in a sense to go walking, but also, there's cost in that. So whatever works well for you, but I think probably the most popular dog is like a golden retriever, lab, or something like that. But it depends. Maybe as well, a nice thing is to foster and see what type of dog works for you, or go to a shelter and see what kind of dog responds best to your son. Or sorry, I'm assuming that's a son. I don't know why.